My husband hid his mistress for 5 years, and she turned out to be my own sister. I found her lipstick in my husband's car. I said nothing, simply invited her to dinner. What happened next? Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me, "Didn't you see the signs?" And I want to laugh. Not the kind of laugh that comes from something being funny, but the kind that comes from something being so painfully true it bypasses your throat and just sits there in your chest like a stone. Of course I saw the signs. I saw all of them. I just didn't want to understand what they were spelling out. My name is Claire. Claire Merritt, though by the time this story ends, I had taken back my maiden name, Holloway, and I wore it like armor. But let me start at the beginning, back when my life looked, from the outside, like something worth envying. We lived in a beige colonial house on Sycamore Drive in Naperville, Illinois. Daniel and I had been married for 11 years. He was a civil engineer, steady, respected, the kind of man who remembered to change the car's oil and never forgot a parent-teacher conference. We had 2 kids, Mia, 9, and Owen, 6. We had a golden retriever named Biscuit, a Volvo, and a joint savings account that was quietly, steadily growing. We had, or so I thought, a life. My sister Rachel was 3 years younger than me. She was the kind of woman people noticed when she walked into a room, not because she was flashy, but because she had this warmth, this ease, that made everyone feel like they were her favorite person. She was my maid of honor. She was the first person I called when I found out I was pregnant both times. She babysat Mia and Owen so Daniel and I could have date nights. She came to our house for Thanksgiving every single year and helped me make the cranberry sauce from scratch. I loved her completely and without reservation. That is the part that still takes my breath away. The first sign I dismissed was the phone. Daniel had always kept his phone face down on the counter. He said the notifications stressed him out. I believed him because it was a reasonable thing to believe. Then he started taking it into the bathroom. Then he started sleeping with it on his side of the bed, tucked partially under his pillow. I told myself he was managing a stressful project at work. I told myself a lot of things. The second sign was the cologne. He started wearing more of it. Not a new brand, just more. As if the scent needed to last longer than a normal day at the office should require. I noticed it on a Tuesday morning when he leaned over to kiss me goodbye, and the cloud of it was so thick it made my eyes water. I said nothing. What would I even have said? The third sign was Rachel. She started canceling plans, not dramatically. Rachel was never dramatic, but quietly with smooth, apologetic excuses. She had a headache. She had a work deadline. She was out of town visiting a college friend. I missed her, but I didn't question it. She was an adult. People get busy. Life gets complicated. And then there was the lipstick. It was an ordinary Saturday in October. Daniel had gone to the grocery store, or said he had, and I needed the car registration for something, an insurance matter, something dull. I opened the glove box of his Audi and found it there, sitting on top of the manual like it belonged. A tube of lipstick, MAC, shade Diva, a deep burgundy, almost black, the kind of color that makes a statement. I don't wear lipstick. I am a lip balm and a mascara kind of woman. Always have been. Daniel knew that. He had always known that. I picked the tube up and turned it over in my fingers. My hands were completely steady. That surprised me. I had always imagined that a moment like this, if a moment like this ever came, would feel like an earthquake. But my hands were steady, and the car smelled like his cologne, and the autumn light was coming through the windshield in that way it does in Illinois in October, golden and a little sad, and I just sat there. I thought about Rachel. I don't know why she was the first person I thought of, not a coworker, not a neighbor, not some faceless woman from his gym. Rachel. The thought arrived before I could stop it, and once it arrived, it didn't leave. It just sat next to me in the passenger seat, quiet and heavy, like an uninvited guest who knows exactly where the spare key is hidden. I put the lipstick back exactly where I found it. I found the registration. I went back inside the house and started making lunch for the kids, and when Daniel came home with the groceries 40 minutes later, I smiled at him and asked how traffic was. "Fine," he said. "No traffic on a Saturday." "Right," I said. "Of course." I didn't say anything about the lipstick. Not yet, because I needed to be sure, and because some part of me, the part that still wanted to be wrong, needed a little more time. That night, I lay awake next to Daniel for a long time, listening to him breathe. He fell asleep quickly, the way he always did. Head on the pillow, out in minutes, absolutely untroubled by anything at all. I used to find that quality comforting. I used to think it meant he had a clear conscience. Lying there in the dark, I started to recalculate what it actually meant. I went back through 11 years in my head, not searching for proof, I wasn't there yet, but taking inventory. How many evenings had he come home late with thin explanations? How many weekends had Rachel been too busy to come over? How many holidays had I sat at a dinner table with both of them across from me, smiling, passing dishes, asking about the kids, while something I couldn't name moved underneath the surface of everything like a current? The numbers were ugly. By 3 a.m, I had stopped being sad and started being afraid, not of the truth, but of what the truth would cost me. I ran the math with brutal practicality because that is what I do when I panic. I organize. The house was in both our names, but I had put in more of the down payment from money I'd saved before we married. We had joint accounts, but I also had a separate savings account I'd maintained quietly over the years. Not out of distrust, I'd told myself, just out of habit. Looking back, maybe some part of me had always known something. The kids. That was where the fear became something else entirely. Mia and Owen knew their father as a steady, loving presence. They knew their Aunt Rachel as someone who brought them ice cream and read them stories. What was I supposed to do with that? How do you surgically remove 2 people from your children's daily landscape without leaving scars? I didn't cry. I noticed that, the absence of tears, with a kind of grim interest. Instead, I felt a cold clarity settling over me, like the moment before a storm when the wind drops entirely and the air goes very still. I recognized that feeling. I'd felt it once before, during a work crisis years ago when everything was falling apart and I was the only person in the room who kept her head. It was the feeling of a decision being made somewhere below conscious thought. I was not going to fall apart. I was not going to confront Daniel in a screaming match that would accomplish nothing but give him time to prepare. And I was absolutely not going to let Rachel see me coming. The first thing I did, that very weekend, while Daniel took the kids to soccer, was call an attorney. Not a divorce attorney, not yet. A family law attorney named Patricia Ossie, whose name I had gotten from a colleague who'd gone through a difficult divorce 2 years prior. I did not call her from my regular phone. I drove to a coffee shop 3 neighborhoods over, bought a prepaid phone with cash, and called from the parking lot. Patricia answered on the second ring. I told her I needed a consultation. Quiet, discreet, preliminary. She had a cancellation the following Thursday. "No paperwork yet," I said. "I just need to understand what I'm looking at." "That's a smart place to start," she said. I liked her immediately. The second thing I did was begin documenting, not dramatically. No hidden cameras, no private investigators, not yet. Just quiet, careful observation. I started keeping a small notebook, paper, not digital, in my car, in the pocket of the driver's side door. Every time Daniel came home late, I wrote down the date and the stated reason. Every time Rachel canceled plans, I noted it. I took photographs of the mileage on his car before and after he ran errands. The third thing I did was invite Rachel to dinner, not to confront her, not yet. I needed to look at her. I needed to sit across from her at a table and watch her face and see whether I could find the lie in it. I needed to know if the woman I had loved my entire life was capable of looking me in the eye. I texted her on a Sunday afternoon, casual, warm. Hey, stranger. Miss your face. Come for dinner Friday? I'm making your favorite, the butternut squash soup and those rolls you like. She replied within 2 minutes. Oh, I'd love that. It's been too long. What time? Too long. She had said, it's been too long. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood very still for a moment. Then I wrote the date in my notebook. Then I started making a list. Patricia Osei's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a view of the river and a waiting room that was deliberately, thoughtfully calm. Neutral colors, real plants, no aggressive legal imagery. I appreciated the restraint. I sat in a cream-colored chair and held my purse in my lap, and when her assistant called my name, I walked in steadily and sat down and told Patricia everything I knew, which at that point was still mostly intuition dressed up as evidence. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk. The lipstick alone is not proof of infidelity, she said. You know that. I know. But the pattern you're describing, the behavioral changes, the secrecy, the timing with your sister, that's worth taking seriously. Before we talk about any legal strategy, you need documentation, real documentation. She recommended a licensed private investigator, a woman named Sandra Foley who worked domestic cases and was, Patricia said, methodical and discreet. I hired Sandra that same week. I paid a retainer from my personal savings account. I did not tell Daniel. Sandra was everything Patricia had promised. She was a compact woman in her 50s with a forgettable face and an extraordinary ability to be invisible. She didn't promise miracles. She promised methodology. She told me to keep living my normal life, to change nothing in my behavior at home, and to let her work. Dinner with Rachel that Friday was one of the most difficult performances of my life. She came in through the front door with a bottle of wine and her hair down, and she hugged me for a long time, and she smelled like perfume I didn't recognize. I held on to her and thought, how long? I thought, did you think about me? Even once? And then I let go and smiled and said, I'm so glad you came. And I meant it in some terrible way I couldn't fully explain. We ate the soup. We talked about her job, about the kids, about a home renovation she was considering. Daniel was warm and solicitous and kept refilling her wine glass. I watched them. I watched the space between them, whether their hands came too close, whether their eyes held a second too long, whether either of them laughed at something the other said with a private warmth that was a shade too intimate for a brother-in-law and a sister-in-law. I cataloged everything. I gave nothing away. After Rachel left, Daniel said, "It's good that you two are spending more time together. You always seem happier when you see her." I looked at him for a moment. "She's my sister," I said. "Of course I'm happy to see her." He went to bed. I sat at the kitchen table for another hour. The proof came 11 days later. Sandra called me on the prepaid phone on a Wednesday afternoon while I was in the parking lot of Mia's school, waiting for pickup. She said she had something. She said I should come to her office. I went the next morning. She laid 3 photographs on the desk between us. They were taken from a distance, slightly grainy but absolutely clear. Daniel's car parked in front of a short-term rental apartment building on the west side. A building I had never heard of, had no reason to know. Rachel going in the front entrance. 40 minutes later, Daniel following. Another image. The 2 of them leaving together, close. A hand touching the small of her back, his hand on her back. I stared at the photographs for a long time. The room was very quiet. Sandra sat across from me with her hands folded and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. "How long have they been using that apartment?" I asked. Based on the rental records I was able to access, at least 8 months for that address, she said. But the relationship, based on some other indicators I've been tracking, looks considerably longer. 5 years. The number from the title of my own story, which I had somehow known before I knew it. I picked up the photographs. I put them in my bag. I thanked Sandra, told her to keep watching for another 2 weeks, and walked out into the November air. The point of no return doesn't feel the way you expect. You expect it to feel like a door slamming shut. But for me, it felt like a door opening, out onto a long, cold road I hadn't chosen, but was absolutely going to walk. I called Patricia from the parking garage. "I have documentation," I said. "Then we're ready to move," she said. Patricia and I spent 2 weeks building the architecture of what came next. Illinois is not a no-fault only state. While no-fault divorce is available, documented infidelity can affect certain aspects of proceedings. And in our situation, with the assets we had accumulated and the custody arrangement I intended to pursue, every piece of evidence mattered. We were careful. We were deliberate. We moved like people who understood that speed and recklessness are different things. I opened a new individual checking account at a different bank. I had already been keeping records of our shared finances, account statements, property records, both our retirement contributions. I made copies of everything and kept them in a fireproof lockbox at my office. I did not touch the joint accounts beyond normal household spending. I did not telegraph anything. The papers were filed on a Tuesday morning in late November. I was not present for that part. Patricia's office handled the filing. By the time Daniel was served at his workplace that Thursday afternoon, I had already arranged for my mother to pick up Mia and Owen from school and keep them for the weekend. I had already moved what I needed from the house to my office and to my mother's spare room. I had already, in other words, thought 3 moves ahead. Daniel called me 47 times in the first 4 hours after being served. I let every call go to voicemail. The messages moved from stunned to pleading to angry in a progression that was almost clinical in its predictability. I listened to all of them that evening, sitting in my parked car outside my mother's house, taking notes. It was Rachel's call, the 18th, that I listened to last. Her voice was very different from Daniel's. Where he was loud with shock and fear, she was quiet, almost gentle, which was worse. "Claire," she said. "Claire, I know you know. I know that's what this is. Please, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve that. I'm asking you to talk to me. Before this goes any further, please." I replayed it twice. Then I saved it to a voice memo on the prepaid phone and texted it to Patricia. They escalated 4 days later. Daniel arrived at my mother's house on a Sunday evening, uninvited, unannounced, with Rachel beside him. I saw them through the front window before I opened the door. My mother, behind me, said quietly, "Do you want me to call someone?" "No," I said. "I'm fine." I opened the door but did not invite them in. We stood on the front porch in the cold, all four of us. My mother had followed me to the door, which I was grateful for. Daniel said they needed to talk. Daniel said I was making a mistake. Daniel said the kids would suffer. He was not yelling. He was using the measured, rational tone he deployed when he wanted to appear reasonable while being anything but. Rachel stood slightly behind him and said very little, which told me she had coached him or was letting him take the lead to minimize her own exposure. Then he said it. He said that if I proceeded with the divorce in a contested manner, if I used the photographs, he would seek full custody of Mia and Owen on the grounds of my emotional instability and claim that my management of our joint finances had been reckless. It was a threat built out of nothing, and we both knew it, but it landed the way threats always do, even empty ones, like a stone in still water. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at Rachel. Then I said, very quietly, "You should both talk to your attorneys. Good night." I closed the door. My mother made tea. I sat at her kitchen table and my hands, still steady, still that infuriating steadiness, wrapped around the mug, and I told her what Daniel had threatened, and she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since I was a child, a look that said, "You are mine, and I am not afraid." "He has nothing," I said. "Patricia says his custody threat is leverage, not substance." "Then treat it like what it is," my mother said. I called Patricia the next morning. She was not surprised. She told me Daniel's attorney had already made contact, predictably positioning the affair as complicated and suggesting mediation. Patricia said we would not be mediating. She said we were ready for every move they intended to make. I took that weekend. Just that weekend, I drove up to my college roommate Amy's place in Madison, Wisconsin, left the prepaid phone in the car, and spent 2 days walking in the cold along the lake and sleeping 8 hours a night and eating food that someone else cooked. I did not think about Daniel. I did not think about Rachel. I thought about Mia asking me that week if everything was going to be okay, and I thought about what I had said to her. It's going to be different, and different can be good. I believed it. That was the thing that surprised me most. I actually believed it. December arrived with a brittle, clear cold that I found oddly fortifying. There is something about a Midwest winter, its absolute refusal to be anything other than what it is, that I have always found clarifying. Daniel tried a different approach in the first week of December, not threats this time. He sent flowers to my office, not roses, which he knew I found theatrical, but white tulips, which had been my favorite since college. The card said only, "I'm sorry. Can we talk?" I put the tulips in the break room for the office and texted Patricia. "Flowers at work, keeping as documentation." She replied, "Good." Then Rachel tried. She sent a long email, 12 paragraphs, single-spaced, that I read once, forwarded to Patricia, and did not respond to. I will tell you only that it contained the phrases, "You have to understand the context. This wasn't planned," and "I never stopped loving you as my sister." I will let you sit with that. What I noticed during those weeks was how quiet I had become inside, not numb. I want to be precise about this because people often mistake them for the same thing. Numb is the absence of feeling. What I had was different. It was the presence of feeling, fully, without being controlled by it. I was angry. I was grieving. I was afraid some nights in the dark of my mother's guest room in a way that I had not been afraid since I was small. but underneath all of it was this clean, cold certainty that I was doing the right thing and that I would get through it. I think the word for that is resolve. Daniel's attorney floated a settlement offer in mid-December that was, Patricia told me, low by a meaningful margin and structured to complicate custody. We declined and countered. He sent another offer. We declined again. I let Patricia handle the back and forth entirely. I did not engage with Daniel directly, but I needed people around me. That was something I had not fully anticipated, how necessary other human beings would become. I had always been somewhat self-contained, the kind of person who prefers to process alone before reaching out. This situation exceeded my processing capacity. Amy drove down from Madison for a weekend and stayed with me at my mother's. We stayed up until 2 a.m. talking, the way we had in college, and she said things I needed to hear. Not platitudes, not "you deserve better," but real things. You're going to be tired. Let yourself be tired. Don't confuse tired with broken. She had been through her own version of loss years ago, and she knew the terrain. My colleague Denise, who had recommended Patricia, took me to lunch one afternoon and simply sat with me while I talked through the legal situation. She had been through a difficult divorce herself and knew the language, the landmarks, the moments of particular ugliness. Having someone who knew the map was not a small thing. And my mother, who had watched me grow up and had watched Rachel grow up, who was grieving this betrayal in her own quiet and devastating way, while simultaneously holding me up. She never once said anything harsh about Rachel in front of me, not because she wasn't angry, but because she understood that Rachel was still my sister, and that the complexity of that was mine to hold, not hers to simplify. I will not forget that. I also returned to something I'd abandoned years ago, running. Every morning before the kids woke up at my mother's, I ran 3 miles in the cold. It was miserable in the best possible way. It gave me somewhere to put my body while my mind was doing its work. Daniel and Rachel were watching, I knew. Sandra had noted that Daniel had begun making inquiries about our mutual social circle. Checking what Claire has told people, was how she phrased it, which told me he was worried about his reputation. Good. He should be. Rachel, Sandra reported, had not returned to the apartment on the west side since the day of service. Whether that was guilt or legal caution or both, I couldn't say. It didn't matter. The documentation existed. The facts were the facts. I was not at war. That's the thing I want to be clear about. I wasn't burning with vengeance. I was simply, methodically, making sure that the life I was building from the rubble of this one was going to be solid. I had 2 children. I had a career. I had people who loved me. I was going to be fine. I was going to be more than fine. They came on a Sunday in mid-January, both of them, together. This time they called ahead, or rather, Daniel texted ahead, which I suspected was at the direction of his attorney, who was probably telling him to create a paper trail of good faith efforts. He said he and Rachel wanted to sit down as a family. He said it was about the children. He used the word healing twice. I consulted Patricia, who said I was under no legal obligation to meet with them, but that refusing could be framed as obstructionist if I wasn't careful. We agreed I would meet them once, briefly in a public location, with a documented start and end time. I chose the coffee shop where I had first used the prepaid phone, partly for practical reasons and partly because there was a symmetry in it that appealed to me. I arrived 5 minutes early. I chose a table against the wall with a clear view of the entrance and ordered a coffee I didn't intend to drink. I brought nothing with me except my phone, which I set on the table face up, a small, deliberate signal. I also texted Amy the address and the time and said, "If you don't hear from me in 90 minutes, call me." She replied immediately, "Already on it." That small exchange steadied me more than I expected. They arrived together. Daniel was wearing the blue sweater I'd bought him 2 Christmases ago, which I found either unconsciously ironic or consciously calculated and couldn't determine which was worse. Rachel looked pale and had lost weight. She looked like she wasn't sleeping. Part of me, the part that had loved her my entire life, noticed that. The other part of me noted it as information and moved on. They sat down. There was a moment of rearranging. Coats, chairs, the small physical negotiations that fill the space when no one knows who should speak first. Daniel spoke first. He said he understood he had hurt me. He said he took responsibility for his choices. He said that he and Rachel had ended things. He used that phrase, clinical, distance creating, and that both of them wanted to focus on what was best for Mia and Owen. He said that a long, contested divorce would harm the children. He said that maybe, if I was willing to step back from the adversarial approach, we could find a way through this that left everyone with some dignity. I let him finish. I drank a small sip of the coffee. Then Rachel spoke. And this is where the mask slipped. She said she knew I was angry. She said she understood. She said that what had happened was complicated and human. That phrase, complicated and human, delivered with the precise tone of someone who has rehearsed it. And that destroying 2 families over a mistake was not what any of them would want. She said my children needed their father in their lives, fully, not as a visitor. She said, and this is the part I have never forgotten, that I was strong enough to choose peace. Strong enough to choose peace. Let me explain what that meant beneath the surface of it. It meant be quiet, back down, let us off the hook. Call it grace so we can call it grace too. It meant absorb this, swallow it. Smile over it at Christmas dinner for the rest of your life so that 2 people who chose themselves over you don't have to live with what they did. What struck me most, sitting there, was how confident she seemed beneath the performance of remorse. She genuinely believed I might say yes. She had known me my entire life, had been in the room when I was born, had been my maid of honor, had held my newborn children. And she had looked at all of that history and calculated that I could be managed, that I could be redirected with the right words delivered in the right tone. That calculation told me more about who she had become than anything else she could have said. I looked at her for a long moment. My coffee cup was very still in my hands. "Rachel," I said, "I want to ask you something. And I want you to think about it carefully before you answer." She nodded, cautious. "In the last 5 years," I said, "how many times did you sit at my table and eat my food and hold my children and tell me you loved me while this was happening?" The silence was long. A customer at a nearby table laughed at something on their phone. The espresso machine hissed. "That's not," she started. "I'm not asking for an answer right now," I said. "I'm asking you to sit with it." I turned to Daniel. "Your attorney and my attorney are talking," I said. "Everything we need to discuss should go through them. I'm going to ask you not to contact me outside of legal channels again." Daniel leaned forward. His voice dropped, and something changed in it. The reasonable tone cracked, and underneath was something harder, something that was closer to the truth of him. "If you push this, Claire, you won't like how it ends," he said. "I know things about our finances that you don't. I can make this very complicated." I stood up. I put on my coat. I picked up my phone. "I look forward to hearing from your attorney," I said. I walked out. The cold air hit me like a hand against the face, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed through it. Breathed through the fear, which was real, which had arrived when Daniel's voice had changed. Because I was human, and he was the man I had given 11 years of my life to, and it is frightening when someone you loved shows you that they never deserved it. But the fear did something I hadn't expected. It burned, like fuel. I sat in my car for 3 full minutes before starting the engine. I needed those minutes. I let the fear move through me completely. I didn't push it down, didn't talk myself out of it, just let it run its course the way Patricia had once told me. Emotion works best when you give it a lane instead of a wall. Then I started the car. I called Patricia. I told her about Daniel's comment about our finances and about Rachel's performance and about the way the mask had come off at the end. "They're scared," Patricia said. "Good," I said, and I meant it this time with my whole chest. The deposition took place on a Thursday morning in February in a conference room at Patricia's firm. It was a gray, still morning, the kind Chicago suburbs produce in February as if they have a contractual obligation to be relentless. I wore a charcoal blazer and the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me, and I had not slept badly the night before, which surprised me. I had expected to lie awake running scenarios. Instead, I had slept cleanly and woken up with a clarity that felt almost physical, like cold water. Daniel's attorney was a man named Gerald Marsh, whom I had researched thoroughly. He was experienced and strategic and had a tendency, Patricia had told me, to probe for emotional reactions, to press on things until the other party cracked or contradicted themselves. He had a good record. He was not going to like today. Patricia had prepared me for 6 weeks. We had gone through every version of every question Marsh might ask. We had rehearsed my financial history, my parenting record, my working schedule, my social relationships, everything that might be probed for weakness. There were no weaknesses worth finding. I had been a good mother, a reliable professional, and a financially responsible partner. The record was clean. I sat down at the table. Daniel sat across the room, not at the table. Observers sat along the wall. He was very still. I did not look at him for more than a moment. I had practiced that too. The neutral, brief glance that communicates nothing, concedes nothing, reveals nothing. It is harder than it sounds when the person across the room once knew every corner of your life. Rachel was not present. Her attorney had advised her to stay away, which was the right legal advice, and also told me everything I needed to know about what she had been advised regarding her own exposure in this matter. Her absence was, in its own way, a form of testimony. Marsh opened with the finances. He asked about my personal savings account, the one I'd maintained separately throughout the marriage. He asked why I had kept it separate, implying concealment. "Habit," I said. "I've maintained a personal account since I was 22. It predates our marriage by 6 years. I disclosed it fully in our joint financial filings every year." He pivoted to my emotional state, following what he called the dissolution of the marriage. He asked whether I had sought therapy, implying instability. "I began working with a therapist in December," I said. "I'd recommend it to anyone navigating a major life transition. It's been useful." He asked about the private investigator. He asked whether I had been surveilling my husband. I engaged a licensed private investigator after finding evidence that suggested infidelity. I said, "She documented what she found. The documentation is part of the record." He paused, reorganized. I could see him doing it. The slight shift in posture, the glance down at his notes, the reset. I had watched Patricia describe this moment. When Marsh pauses to reorganize, it means the approach he planned isn't working. I kept my face neutral and my hands still on the table in front of me. Then he made the move that Patricia and I had anticipated and prepared for. He suggested that the infidelity, while unfortunate, was a private matter between spouses and should not affect asset division or custody. He asked, carefully as if approaching something fragile, whether I could confirm that my primary motivation in this proceeding was the welfare of my children. My primary motivation, I said, is establishing a stable, honest, and emotionally safe environment for my children, which is why I need the court to have a full and accurate picture of the last 5 years of our family's life. He frowned slightly. And what picture is that exactly? This was the moment. Patricia set 3 documents on the table. Not the photographs, not yet, but financial records Sandra had uncovered in her final 2 weeks of work. Credit card statements under Daniel's name, showing charges at the short-term rental apartment going back 4 years and 11 months. Hotel charges in 2 other states. A wire transfer to an account Patricia's forensic accountant had traced to a joint account opened between Daniel and Rachel 14 months ago. A shared account. They had opened a shared account. The room was very quiet. Marsh studied the documents. Daniel, against the wall, leaned forward. I heard his chair move. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on Marsh, who was reading carefully, and I watched the moment he understood what he was looking at. Not just infidelity, but financial architecture, deliberate and sustained, built across nearly 5 years and 2 states. His expression didn't change, exactly, but something behind it did. A recalibration. An attorney understanding that the case he thought he was managing was not the case he was actually in. "Mr. Merritt," Patricia said pleasantly, turning to address him directly, which was unusual and deliberate, "would you like a moment to confer with your counsel?" The joint bank account. That was what broke things open, not just legally, but in terms of what it revealed about the scope and intentionality of what had been happening. This was not a weakness or an impulse. This was a 5-year architecture. They had been building a parallel life. Daniel began to speak. Marsh put a hand on his arm. Daniel said something low and fast. I couldn't hear it, but I watched his face, and what I saw there was not grief or remorse. What I saw was the face of someone whose calculation had failed, someone who had run a long, careful play and discovered that the other person had been running a longer, more careful one. He had believed, I think, that I was the kind of woman who could be managed, who would be too hurt, too disoriented, too emotionally consumed to be methodical. He had been wrong about that for 11 years without knowing it. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment I felt the weight of 11 years. The real weight, not the story we'd told ourselves, but the actual thing, which was complicated and human and also deeply, quietly wrong. "We'll need a recess," Marsh said. "Of course," Patricia said. We broke for 20 minutes. When we reconvened, the tone of the proceeding had changed entirely. The terms that emerged over the following 6 weeks were, by any measure, a comprehensive victory, not a cruel one. I want to be clear about that distinction. I did not set out to destroy Daniel. I set out to protect myself and my children, and the difference matters, even if the outcome looks similar from the outside. The house went to me, along with a buyout of Daniel's equity, calculated at full market value, because there was no longer any leverage for him to negotiate downward. The forensic accountant's work revealed that over 4 years and 11 months, Daniel had redirected roughly $63,000 from various shared financial instruments to support the life he was building with Rachel. Patricia ensured that figure was factored into the settlement with interest. Daniel's attorney attempted twice to dispute the forensic methodology. Both attempts failed. There was no version of the numbers that told a different story. I received primary physical custody of Mia and Owen, with Daniel having regular parenting time, every other weekend and one weekday evening. This was not a vindictive arrangement. It was what the evaluator, a child psychologist appointed by the court, had recommended based on the children's attachment patterns and daily routines. Daniel had been a present father in the logistical sense. He attended events, helped with homework, but the primary emotional and organizational labor of parenting had consistently fallen to me, and the evaluator saw it clearly. Daniel was ordered to maintain his contributions to both children's college savings funds and to carry health insurance for them through his employer plan. His attorney had attempted in the final negotiations to trade some of these obligations for a reduction in the asset settlement. Patricia declined. "This is not a negotiation about the children," she told Marsh at one point. "These are their father's baseline obligations. They're not currency." Marsh had nothing to say to that. What happened to Rachel was a separate matter, though not entirely disconnected. The joint bank account she and Daniel had opened became relevant not only to the divorce settlement but to a civil matter. Patricia advised me that I had grounds to pursue Rachel for her participation in the financial dissipation of marital assets, given the documented transfers. I thought about it seriously. I consulted Patricia carefully. I sat with it for 2 weeks, turning it over, weighing the costs against the satisfaction I knew would be partial at best and temporary at worst. In the end, I did not pursue Rachel in court, not because I forgave her. Forgiveness is a longer road than a legal filing, and I was still somewhere in the middle of it. But because I had already taken everything I needed from this process, and adding Rachel as a defendant in a civil case would have extended the legal proceedings by months or years, cost me significant additional money, and kept both of us locked in this story longer than I was willing to remain. I had spent 5 years, unknowingly, living inside their story. I was not going to spend one more unnecessary day there. I chose to close the chapter rather than prolong it. That was my choice, made clearly with full information, and I do not regret it. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in late April. I signed the last document in Patricia's office, shook her hand, a firm, warm handshake between two women who had done precise, difficult work together, and walked out into a spring afternoon that was, in the way of Midwest springs, aggressively lovely. The trees along the river walk were just coming into leaf. The air smelled like rain and green things. I stood on the sidewalk outside Patricia's building, and I tipped my face up toward the sky for a moment, the way you do when you need to feel that something is larger than yourself, and the light came through the new leaves in that particular way it does in April, scattered, golden, everywhere at once. I sat on a bench by the river for about 20 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. Triumph implies a battle that was never really what I wanted. What I felt was something quieter and more durable. Relief. The specific relief of having made it through something that could have unmade me and finding yourself on the other side, still standing. Mia called me on my way back to the car. She wanted to know what we were having for dinner. I laughed. An actual, real laugh, the kind that starts in your stomach, and told her I was thinking tacos. "With the guacamole?" she asked. "With the guacamole," I said. "Okay," she said. "Good." I drove home, to our house, to my house. A year is long enough to see clearly and short enough that the clarity still feels earned. By the following April, a full year after the divorce was finalized, my life had taken on a shape I recognized as genuinely mine, maybe for the first time in over a decade. I had repainted the living room a color I had wanted for years, and Daniel had always called too much. I had converted the spare bedroom into an actual home office with a desk by the window and shelves I had built myself, with Owen handing me screws and Mia reading the instructions aloud in a voice of exaggerated authority. I had planted things in the backyard: tomatoes, herbs, flowers that served no purpose except being beautiful. And the children had helped me do it, their hands in the dirt, their voices overlapping and arguing and delighting. Mia, at 10, had started taking photography classes on Saturday mornings. She came home each week with prints she'd made herself, close-up shots of leaves, of Biscuit sleeping, of Owen's hands mid-Lego build, and she taped them to the kitchen wall in a growing grid that I left exactly as she arranged it, because it was hers, and it was honest, and it was art. Owen, at 7, had developed an obsessive interest in building things. Lego, wooden models, anything with parts. I spent Sundays with them in a way that felt different from before. Unhurried, present, without the low-level static of anxiety that I hadn't even recognized as constant until it was gone. That absence of that particular hum of unease I had lived inside for years was the thing I noticed most in quiet moments. The house felt different when it held no secrets. I had been promoted at work in the fall, a role I had been circling for 2 years, delayed partly because I had been holding myself back, keeping myself smaller than I needed to be, for reasons I now understood more clearly. The promotion came with a team to lead and problems to solve, and a salary increase that made the monthly budget considerably less fraught. My manager told me during the review that I had always been capable of the role, that the question had never been my ability but my availability, meaning the bandwidth I seemed to be reserving for something she couldn't see. I understood what she meant. I had been spending years managing an invisible weight. I ran a half marathon in September. I finished it and stood at the finish line with Amy, who had driven down for it, and I thought, I built this person. She existed before, and she still exists, and nothing that happened could take her away from herself. Amy and I talked every week. Denise and I had lunch twice a month. My mother and I had a standing Sunday phone call that had become something I protected fiercely in my calendar. 50 minutes, always with tea, always ending with her saying something that managed to be both practical and profound. I had, without quite planning it, built the kind of community around myself that I had always assumed I would have time for later. It turned out later was now. It had always been now. As for Daniel, I learned what I learned, the way you learn things in a small social world, which is imperfectly and not always on purpose. He moved into an apartment on the north side of Naperville. He and Rachel were together, officially, publicly, in the way you become public when there's nothing left to hide. People in our social circle went quiet when his name came up around me, which I appreciated and also found faintly absurd. I was not fragile, and the discomfort belonged to them, not to me. The relationship lasted, from what I understand, about 8 months before it became what it perhaps had always been destined to become. 2 people who had constructed their connection entirely on the foundation of deception, now trying to build something ordinary on top of it, and discovering that ordinary things require a kind of honesty that neither of them had demonstrated particular aptitude for. What works in secret rarely survives the light. The rumors arrived quietly, the way rumors do in communities where people have children in the same schools. Daniel had been passed over for a promotion at his firm. There was some question of professional conduct, I was told, though I didn't probe the details. The apartment he shared with Rachel was given up by spring. Someone said they had moved to separate places. Someone else said Rachel had left Naperville entirely and taken a job in another city, starting over somewhere no one knew her story. I understood the impulse, even as I recognized it for what it was, not a fresh start, but a relocation of the same unresolved self. I did not feel satisfaction at this exactly. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something more like the particular tiredness that comes after a long effort is over, a laying down of something heavy. Their difficulties were not my doing and not my responsibility. They had made choices that had consequences. That was all. That was really all there was to say. What I had was the house on Sycamore Drive, which had become genuinely home in the year since the divorce. What I had was Mia and Owen, growing and whole and still able to be surprised by things. What I had was a circle of people who knew me, who had shown up for me, who I was showing up for in return. What I had was a life that was honest all the way through. I had one last encounter with Rachel, brief, accidental, at a grocery store in March. We saw each other across the produce section. We both went very still for a moment. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and hadn't yet put it down. I wondered briefly whether she ever would, whether she had the capacity to sit with what she had done and move through it honestly, or whether she would spend years finding new ways to explain it to herself. I thought about everything I could have said, everything I had rehearsed, in the dark, during the worst nights, every question and accusation and grief. I put a bag of apples in my cart and I nodded at her, a small civil nod, and I turned and walked toward the checkout. What else was there? The story was already written. I had already told it the only way that mattered, by surviving it and by building something better from what was left. If this story taught me anything, it is this. The deepest betrayals come from the people you trusted enough to stop watching, and what defines you is not the betrayal itself. It is the choice you make in the hour after you find the lipstick in the glove box. I chose silence over screaming, documentation over drama, patience over panic, and I chose my children first, every single time without exception. Don't mistake stillness for weakness. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has already won. So tell me honestly, if you were sitting in that car holding that lipstick, what would you do? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe. And thank you, genuinely, for being here.